You think the government protects its citizens from terrorism. But in 1962, America's highest-ranking generals signed a document authorizing staged attacks on American soil. The plan had a name, a budget, and 33 steps. Not a conspiracy theory, not a rumor passed between strangers at the edge of paranoia. A declassified, stamped, and countersigned Pentagon memorandum, 15 pages long, drafted in formal government language, submitted through official channels by men who wore their nation's highest military rank. The plan was called Operation Northwoods, and it nearly launched a war. This is not what they taught you in school. This is what the files actually say. Tonight we open the buried archive. Nothing has been sanitized. The document is formally titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba, classified top secret, drafted March 13, 1962. Every branch of the United States military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps Joint Chiefs signed it. It sat locked in classified storage for 35 years. It was not declassified by a whistleblower or a leak. It surfaced in 1997 through the JFK Assassination Records Review Board, a congressional mandate. The signatures were still there. The ink had not faded. To understand the men who wrote this document, you have to understand the world they believed they were fighting to save. The Cold War in 1962 was not an abstraction. It was a daily atmospheric pressure, felt in fallout shelter drills, in the shadow of Soviet missiles 90 miles off the Florida coast, in the whispered certainty among senior military planners that the next miscalculation could end civilization. Fear at that scale does not produce caution. It produces the willingness to do things that in peacetime would be unthinkable. And inside the Pentagon, that willingness had a name. His name was General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful military officer in the United States of America in 1962. He was not reckless. He was not unstable. He was, by every institutional measure, the product of a system that had rewarded him for decades of disciplined, strategic thinking. He had served in World War II. He had navigated the Korean conflict. He understood the architecture of power at its highest level. And that is precisely what makes Operation Northwoods so unsettling. This was not the work of a rogue. This was the work of a man operating well within the logic of his institution. Lemnitzer believed President John Kennedy was soft, too cautious, too reluctant to neutralize Fidel Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion had collapsed the previous April. Roughly 1,200 CIA-backed Cuban exiles captured or killed, Kennedy publicly humiliated, and Castro politically strengthened in the eyes of the world. In the corridors of the Pentagon, that failure did not produce restraint. It produced urgency. If a covert proxy war had failed, the logic that followed was simple and dangerous. Manufacture a justification for an overt one. Working alongside Lemnitzer was Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a covert operations architect, a man who had run psychological warfare campaigns in Vietnam and the Philippines. Lansdale was not a soldier in the conventional sense. He was a storyteller, a fabricator of realities designed to manipulate populations. Kennedy's administration handed him the mandate for Operation Mongoose in November of 1961. The mission was simple in its ambition and grave in its implications: remove Castro by any means necessary. Lansdale brought to the table something more dangerous than firepower. He brought imagination, the capacity to engineer perception at a national scale. Then there were the people who never got to read the document with their names in it. Cuban exile groups, described in the memorandum as friendly Cubans in uniform, recruited to play the role of aggressors in staged attacks they did not know were staged. And beyond them, further down the chain of expendability, were ordinary American civilians, people walking streets in Miami, people boarding flights out of Florida. People whose fates, the document calculated, would move public opinion in the right direction. These were not abstractions, they were real people in real cities, and the plan had their streets mapped. The machinery of Operation Mongoose accelerated through the first months of 1962 faster than almost anyone in Kennedy's civilian administration understood. The special group augmented. The classified interagency committee overseeing Mongoose voted on March 13, 1962 to broaden the program's operational guidelines to include the potential for direct military intervention. That same day, Lemnitzer formally transmitted the Northwoods memorandum to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara received it. He did not destroy it, he filed it. There is no documented record of a formal objection. That silence is worth holding. The Secretary of Defense of the United States received a proposal for staged attacks against American civilians, and the institutional response was a filing cabinet. Inside Northwoods, the proposals were specific to a degree that removes any possible defense of ambiguity. Read the language carefully. This is what institutional state deception actually looks like when it is written in bureaucratic English. One proposal called for a real commercial airliner to depart from a United States airport, carrying passengers who were in fact CIA operatives traveling under false identities. At a designated mid-flight rendezvous point over Florida airspace, the aircraft would swap positions with an identical remote-controlled drone. The real plane would divert and land secretly at Eglin Air Force Base. The drone would then be destroyed over the ocean. A fabricated distress signal recorded in advance would be broadcast. Cuba would be blamed. Casualty lists would be prepared and released to newspapers. The names on those lists would belong to people who were still alive, hidden at a military installation, their identities erased. A nation would grieve for the living, and the grief would be used. That is not interpretation. That is not extrapolation. That is the document paragraph by paragraph. A second proposal called for the deliberate sinking of a United States vessel near Guantanamo Bay Harbor. The memorandum used the phrase, "a funeral for mock victims." The spectacle of an American military funeral, broadcast nationally, grieved nationally, would, the authors calculated, produce sufficient public outrage to justify war. The proposal understood something fundamental about modern democracies. Populations do not mobilize for geopolitical strategy. They mobilize for coffins. Give them the coffins and the war follows. A third proposal called for staged detonations in the streets of Washington, D.C. and Miami. Civilian casualties, American casualties, engineered, choreographed, and attributed to Cuban operatives who had no connection to the attacks. Roughly 33 separate pretexts for war were contained within the document. Each one was a fabrication designed to simulate Cuban aggression. Each one required the death or disappearance of American citizens. The document did not treat this as a moral problem. It treated it as a logistical one. What is perhaps most forensically revealing is not the violence the plan proposed. It is the administrative care with which it was composed. Northwoods read like a project management brief. Timelines, resource allocations, cover story protocols, contingency framings. The bureaucratic language sanitized the proposals into something that resembled routine operational planning. That normalization was itself a weapon, a way of making the unacceptable legible within institutional culture. Kennedy rejected the plan. The accounts describe his reaction as cold fury. He reportedly told an aide, and this account is disputed but widely cited, that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. What is not disputed is the outcome. Lemnitzer was removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was transferred to NATO Supreme Allied Commander. October of 1963, 1 month before Dallas. The document was locked in classified storage. No congressional hearing was convened. No public accounting was made. No senior military officer was censured, investigated, or disciplined. The Cuban exile groups recruited as props in Mongoose's operations never learned how close they had come to being sacrificed. The families of American civilians named in the casualty list proposals never knew their streets had appeared in a Pentagon war game scenario. For 35 years, Operation Northwoods did not exist. And then, in 1997, a congressional board opened the wrong filing cabinet. The JFK Assassination Records Review Board was not looking for Northwoods. It was searching for documents related to the Kennedy assassination. What it found, archived alongside those materials, was a 15-page memorandum that rewrote the official history of American military ethics in the Cold War era. The board was not staffed by investigators with an agenda. It was a bipartisan congressional body executing a statutory mandate. What it uncovered was not a leak. It was a filing error, the kind of institutional carelessness that occasionally allows the archive to speak. In 2001, journalist James Bamford published Body of Secrets, the first mainstream account to bring the full scope of Northwoods to a wide public audience. The national security establishment said nothing, no rebuttal, no context, no apology. Silence, as this case demonstrates, is its own form of propaganda. The Joint Chiefs' institutional reputation remained untouched. History textbooks continued to describe the Cold War era as tense but controlled. They lied by omission, and the omission held for another generation. The full, unredacted 15-page Northwoods document is today archived at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. Academic peer review, including analysis published in the journal Intelligence and National Security, has confirmed the document's complete authenticity. There are no disputed signatures. There are no forged seals. The document is exactly what it appears to be, a unanimous institutional proposal for state-sponsored deception authored by the most powerful military officers in the United States, submitted through official government channels, and formally received by the Secretary of Defense. As of 2026, no formal congressional apology regarding Operation Northwoods has ever been issued. No acknowledgement, no revision of the historical record in any official government publication. The men who signed it died with their reputations intact. Their portraits hang in the halls of institutions that have never been asked to account for what those men proposed. Operation Northwoods was not an aberration. It was not a fever dream at the fringe of the national security apparatus. It was the system working as designed, a system built on plausible deniability, on the doctrine that civilians are variables in strategic equations, on the institutional belief that truth is a resource to be managed rather than a principle to be honored. The proposal passed through layers of review. It accumulated signatures. It arrived on the Secretary of Defense's desk with the full institutional weight of the American military behind it. One man said no. The system moved on. Kennedy's rejection was singular. It was fragile. One man, one decision. No structural safeguard existed to prevent the proposal from reaching his desk. No structural safeguard exists today to guarantee that a successor document is not sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere, waiting for a different president to reach a different decision. The archive does not self-correct. It waits, and it only speaks when someone opens the right drawer. The lesson is not that every government is irredeemably evil. The lesson is simpler and harder than that. Verify everything. Demand accountability before the archive opens. Because by the time the files are declassified, the men who signed them are already gone. If you made it here, you already understand something that most people never get the chance to confront. The official version of history is not the complete version. Operation Northwoods is real. The document is public. The signatures are there. Subscribe now because next week we open another file they believed would stay buried. Leave a comment below. Which part of this case changed how you see the historical record? We read every response. What's buried always surfaces. Until next time, stay blessed.